This is week 3 of Patrick Lecture 211 on how outer events reflect self-creation. And we've talked about 2 other topics, and this week we're looking at increasing both inner and outer awareness. So we've just been discussing pride, self-will, and fear, which is mentioned in the first section. That's a lecture in and of itself, Patrick Lecture 30. Why is that mentioned in terms of awareness? Because pride, self-will, and fear interfere with awareness. And so there's a small formula for understanding when something is prideful versus fearful versus willful. And that is that pride always says, I'm better than. Now, they might be more subtle than that, and they might just say, I'm fine. But pride's not going to admit that they need more awareness. Pride's not going to admit that they need more skills or that they need some improvement. Now, we're talking about the distortion of pride. Good pride says, of course, I want to take care of myself and I will educate myself as needed. We're usually, or almost universally, talking about the distortions of these elements. The distortion of self-will says, I must be in charge, I have to have this, you must do that. It's always a command, it's a demand, because that's how self-will operates. It flexes its muscles in the world. So the idea of being vulnerable is totally antithetical to the well-being of the self-will. Fear says, I'm afraid. And you finish that sentence any way you want, because there will always be something to fear. I'm afraid to look. I'm afraid what I'll find. I'm afraid somebody will think badly of me, which mixes in with pride. I'm afraid that somebody will take advantage, which mixes in with self-will. These are not discrete categories. They overflow and intermix. And the guide at one point says that fear is the greatest addiction on the planet. If there's one thing we do other than perceive dualistically, it's that we are afraid. But duality is the result of fear. It is our fear that wants to boil the choices down to 1 or 2 so that we don't feel overwhelmed and things are easier. And then the choice that makes us feel better, look better, feel more powerful, that's the one we're going to take. Almost universally, we're not going to be mature enough to take a choice that impacts our self-esteem, that impacts our ability to move around in the world, or that brings us more fear. So the duality is driven by the fear of not understanding exactly what's going on and trying to make it simple. And as you may know, sometimes when you simplify, you lose the nuance and you lose the truth of the matter. You create false choices. So the key is to explore yourself and stop hiding the negative aspects of yourself. And one of the ways that Patrick teaches this is exemplified in Patrick Lecture 195, which is identifying versus identifying with, meaning that the idea here is to identify our flaws versus identifying with our flaws. To be realistic that there are aspects of us that need re-education, training, maturity, reining in a little bit, and to take action accordingly, because that element of us is not us, it's an element. So to see these flaws, to see these problems as aspects of ourselves, and then realize that there's a larger aspect of us that can be brought to deal with them. Now, the second aspect of this is, and I always make jokes out of these things, what I have observed very often is I find most useful if there's a stationary map, if it has the red X, you are here. Because otherwise, if I don't know where I am, I may not be able to look at a map and identify landmarks well enough to figure out where I am. And so universally, when tourist signs and mall signs and department store signs, when they give you a map, they'll put a marker saying, this is where you are. That's what awareness gives us. It gives us information about where we already are. So to close our eyes and refuse that information doesn't make any sense. Now, when we make mistakes, sometimes what we do is we blind ourselves because of those mistakes. We make a mistake and we say, oh, that whole territory is dangerous. I'm going to cross it off my list. I'm never going to go to that group again. I'm never going to attempt that activity again. We just completely cross it off. And you can probably feel the pride, self-will, and fear in doing that. We're trying to safeguard our self-esteem, safeguard our sense of power, and stop the fear. And we overgeneralize. So I will give you an example from my childhood. I never quite know how to start this story because it's so dumb. I was 11 years old and I was riding my bike on a Saturday and I was going down a lengthy hill where there was a 6-foot deep and 6-foot wide ditch on one side with posts so that cars wouldn't accidentally drive into the ditch. As I'm driving down this street with no bike lane and no sidewalk, I had the thought, I wonder how blind people ride bikes. So being 11 years old, I closed my eyes and rode my bike. And of course the road curved, but even if it didn't, there's no way I'd stay in a straight line. And then when I opened my eyes, some number of seconds later, I watched my bike hit a post and flip me into the ditch. Very nice lady stopped her car, helped me climb out of the ditch, helped me pull my bike out of the ditch, and drove me home because the bike was unrideable. Why am I bringing that story up now? Number one, that's the story that I go to when I do really stupid things. Because that's about the dumbest thing I probably ever did. The trick is, the original question, innocent question, was how do blind people ride bikes? Well, blind people don't ride bikes in such dangerous conditions. If they're going to ride a bike, they might ride in an open parking lot with no cars or in a safe place so that they can exercise bike riding skills, but certainly not deal with dangers that they can't see. But I didn't sit down and write a thesis on this. I just had the thought when I was riding my bike. So I could have decided that it was dangerous to ride bikes because I might close my eyes for a second and you see what happens. That would be fear exaggerating the situation and making it so dramatic that I would never go bike riding again. Pride could blank the entire experience out so that I just didn't manage to remember it because it was quite humiliating to be fished out of a ditch by a stranger. Self-will, I'll let you imagine what self-will might do with that. But here's my point. As we exercise increased awareness, both inner and outer, observing, getting feedback, matching it with our inner senses, going back and forth and seeing if there's any discrepancies, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to match things up incorrectly. You're going to come to the wrong conclusion. Life moves on. If you come to a wrong conclusion, you will find out that in some period of time. Now, Pathwork spends a lot of time talking about images that are formed in childhood. The dilemma with images, they are conclusions that we've come to that seem to work. They work pretty consistently. They make us happy. They make sense of the world and they calm us down. So we use them as guideposts, inner guideposts that become unconscious so that we can't bring them up and look at them again. Developing inner and outer awareness as adults will not lead you to that kind of a problem because we're not going to decide that mommies hurt babies or daddies run away just because that was our particular experience. We will be adult enough to open up and look around and witness other families, other people, other circumstances, so that we can test our conclusions far more thoroughly. You are far more confident as an adult than you were as a child. So that if you make these conclusions, the next thing is always to test them out. So it's not just a matter of opening our eyes and looking and taking in information. It's testing it. It's comparing them. I spend a lot of time talking about discrepancies. Discrepancies is a description of my inner process. When something, it's a feeling that something doesn't quite fit. I may not know why. I may not be able to explain it, but I don't put it away. I don't accept it as a connection that works because something's just not right. The outer example that I would have is that you may have had is that when you're doing jigsaw puzzles, there are pieces that may almost fit into a slot that they don't belong in. And we may be careless and push it in and think that it fits. And it may take a while before we find the correct piece and have to undo some bits. But there's always evidence. There's always some evidence when we make a significant mistake. And the idea of outer awareness is to allow that evidence in, compare it to the inner sensation, and go back and forth until we feel that we have a conclusion that works, and then test that out for a while. So this process of looking at how, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, how outer events reflect self-creation is you're seeing some effects and you're comparing them to some causes that you may know about, some self-creations, and you're going back and forth with cause and effect, just like you would do in cooking or in any hobby or in your work or your school work. You test and verify until you feel that you have a handle on what you're working on. So, brief illustration of Pathwick Lecture 3 from Pathwick Lecture 211. Please keep in mind that I edit the lectures, so this is not all there is in the study guide. There's more in the lecture. Please read it, and thanks for listening.